try that. Oh,
yeah, there we go.
So we're putting the basically Ladybeetles on the Haliburton Highlands map, but even more so putting Haliburton Highlands Ladybeetles on more of a national provincial map when you start doing a project like this. I do have my contact information there. I am from the University of Guelph, where is the oldest insect collection is present. The University of Guelph insect collection, oldest collection in Canada, should I preface that with. And again, social media is there. I do have my email up at the end. So if you guys have any questions later on or want to send me an email, perfect. There we go. A bit of background. Again, Dr. Steve Paiero. I have my Bachelor of Science, Master's of Science, and PhD from the University of Guelph. This is what is sometimes referred to as academically inbred. The reason being is that I loved University of Guelph so much, I decided to just keep on staying there. And again, there's a great program involving entomology. My main interest was initiated in 1999. That's from a great field course from one of the professors there, Dr. Steve Marshall. He then convinced me to actually take an MSc on the insects of tallgrass prairies in Ontario. And this major focus was in documenting species, specifically at the Ojibwe Prairie Nature Reserve. But I was actually sampling at a few other sites, other tallgrass sites in southwestern Ontario. Since then, I've also been involved in a number of other survey projects. I've helped sample the Bruce Peninsula, Rondeau Provincial Park, Point Pelee National Park. Again, these are all sort of southwestern species, high levels of species richness when it comes to insects. I've also been involved with a couple other projects playing around with emerald ash borer and wasps, things like that. Following that, I actually did a PhD on a group of flies called the Sphaerocerids. For this talk, completely inconsequential, but odds are you have Sphaerocerids surrounding you. It's a very common group of flies, but most people just completely are oblivious to this group. Since 2017, when the position of actually curator at the University of Guelph was created, I have been said curator. Previous to that, we've had a number of different sort of contract curators, nothing actually as a full-time position. And purpose at the University of Guelph insect collection is important, so I'm going to give a bit of background there, and it actually will play into the importance later on as we look at these Ladybeetles. Now, this collection began in 1863, so we were actually, before even Canada was Canada. We were basically established in London, Ontario. It moved around a lot, but eventually got itself into Guelph, where it became a bit more of an agricultural reference and teaching collection, basically teaching people what bugs were trying to eat their plants or what insects were eating those bugs that were eating our plants. But slowly it started developing, getting larger and larger. In the late 70s, research component was really thrown in there, and it really sort of expanded. This is systematic. So systematics is looking at what new species, how the relationships, all those things. But we've also expanded into doing surveys. So surveys of Pinery Provincial Park, Point Pelee was heavy into it, and Bruce Peninsula was a big one actually for many years. Our collection currently houses about 3 to 4 million pinned insects. So we're probably about the third or fourth largest collection in Canada. When we compare that to a lot of university collections, we're a fairly large university collection. This is basically almost individual researchers have developed this collection. When you get into larger collections that are supported by public funds, the ROM, Royal Alberta Museum, Canadian National Collection, these collections get to be a lot larger. So the Canadian National Collection, I think, is something like 20 million insects. So again, we're a decent size, if anything, as a university collection. And our strengths are the true flies. So you guys live up north, so you love your black flies and mosquitoes. But this covers everything from house flies to that little group called Sphaerocerids, and all the way down to crane flies and mosquitoes and everything in between there. We also have a strength in Ontario diversity. Again, basically look at that first line. 1863 is when we've been collecting insects from Ontario, which means we have this great measure of what insects have been present in Ontario over the entire timeline. Now, again, as I mentioned, all these components are important to contributing to what we know about our Ladybeetles, because we can sort of say with somewhat confidence that when a species was around, and a little bit more harder to say when a species disappeared. Now, it really is hard to quantify when something's not present, but at least we can quantify when things were present and abundant. just as a quick little virtual tour, I guess, if you come to the University of Guelph Insect Collection, basically it is not a display collection. This is a research collection, which means everything's tucked away in these big cabinets. Each cabinet holds about 26 drawers. Each one of these drawers can hold up to several hundred different specimens, depending on the size of the insect. So if you see something like this, we have our dragonflies. They tend to be in envelopes. So usually they don't have as many specimens there, or they're larger stink bugs. But when you get to these little tiny flies, top left corner, then you can put a whole whack load of them in there. And then we also have residues. These are things that we've sampled insects for. And a lot of times people will come to our collection to examine these residues to extract groups that they're interested in. Before getting too much farther though, I should mention a few things. Dr. Steve Marshall, I'm indebted to him for his use of photos. A lot of these photos have been utilized in his education purposes as a professor, and they are basically Steve Marshall's unless otherwise indicated, or from, I guess, our lab. I also acknowledge the Kosiwa coccinellid report. I can make that available to Shelley at a later date, but this basically just actually discusses a lot more in depth than what we're going into today about these individual species, how their disappearances timed with invasive species or other elements that might have impacted them. And also the Wild 2010 report, which again examined the species that are present in Canada, and basically just try to sort of assess how they were faring. Just a bit of a roadmap. Basically, I'm just going to sort of try to deal with the broader information on Ontario lady beetle diversity. We're going to be looking at species conservation interest, the lost what is known has been refound, and then a bit of a what species can be confused with them. I will also look at that in terms of lady beetles, because there are a number of different groups of beetles that are quasi looking like lady beetles. If you know your lady beetles, they don't look that much alike, but if you don't know your lady beetles that great, then they might be misconstrued as lady beetles. Basically, I almost take that as, cat, go away. I take that as it's got sort of bright colorations and sort of is a sort of a shiny looking beetle to look like a lady beetle. In terms of diversity, coccinellid. So this is actually derived from Coccineus, which is basically red like a berry. And this sort of almost talks to how many lady beetles are sort of a bright red or have bright red within them on their coloration. There's about 6,000 species worldwide. In Canada, we're looking at somewhere between 161 to 166 species. And this is a bit of a difference between checklist versus the wild numbers. Now, this often happens when sometimes there's issues of species identification. If it's a really difficult species to separate, then maybe somebody's misidentified something. Sometimes it means that there's a synonymy. So that means two species that are described are actually the exact same species, but for whatever reason, they were accidentally described as two different species. And of these 166 species, about 84 are recorded in Ontario. I do say about 84 because there's always room for another species to sort of come across. Obviously, we have invasive species that are slowly expanding their ranges, especially in the eastern United States. But yeah, lady beetles in general can be recognized by a tarsal pattern. So when we say tarsal pattern, basically we're going to be looking at these little tiny sort of tarsi. These are little segments at the tips of their legs. And they also have a variety of other sort of characters here that I'll sort of show you with a example here. So this is one of our common native species. This is a spotted lady beetle, Columella maculata. Now, all beetles generally have sort of three aspects, and especially for the course of this talk, the three important parts that we'll be talking about are the head, which is sort of on the left-hand side, the pronotum, which is sort of in the middle, almost hidden a little bit behind that, that part of that flower, and then the elytra. And the elytra are basically thickened forewings of beetles. They are utilized to protect the hind wings and are also thought to act as almost sails as they're flying around. And the pronota and the elytra are extremely important in their patterns and coloration to help us recognize different species in Ontario. Other things that sort of help us recognize this as a lady beetle, generally, if you look at the sort of front, I'm not sure if you can see my little pointer there, but they have these sort of short antennae that are never as long as the head and pronotum combined. They have a weak little club. We often call it sort of clavate but this weak little club on the end almost looks like a thin bat. Again, I mentioned the tarsi. They often are very dome shaped, but the tarsal segmentation isn't important. And I lean away from the tarsal segmentation here because, as you can sort of see in this image, you have one tarsal segmentation, one tarsal segment, here's another tarsal segment, here's another one, and the fourth segment's really, really hard to see. And for the ability of most people actually recognize that with even a good camera is pretty difficult. Other things that should be noted for lady beetle behavior that also help us recognize that they're lady beetles is they're often found on plants, running around on leaf surfaces, looking for prey items. So aphids, scales, other soft-bodied insects. They do sometimes hang out under or hang out with fungi. Sometimes they hang out under bark, but these are less frequent things to find them at. We, of course, as a holometabolous insect, holometabolous insect is basically an insect that goes from an egg to a larva to a pupa to an adult. We often encounter lady beetle larvae too out and about. Now, larvae are a little bit more difficult to identify. In many cases, we can only identify them to genus. That's because a lot of the species utilize male sexual characters for their identification and actually require a close examination. I will sort of discuss this a little bit more, but these are usually involve the little tiny beetles that most of us are going to overlook as lady beetles. So again, the focus on this talk will be on the adults themselves. One great thing about lady beetles is they are aposematically colored. They have these bright colors. They're basically trying to sort of showcase that they are toxic to be fed upon. They will cause some sort of response by the predator. These chemicals are used to help repel ants and quail. And basically what they do is they do the reflex bleeding. So they're basically sort of, they'll flex their joints, and then basically from the membranes, you'll actually have these this hemolymph. They'll sort of come out. And often if you're handling a lady beetle, you can even smell the chemicals. They're sort of somewhat aromatic, often referred to as the lady beetle stink. Now, a couple groups that, especially up your way, you might be akin to misidentifying lady beetles. Handsome fungus beetles. Here's two species that are fairly commonly encountered in Ontario. The bottom left one, especially because of that bright orange coloration, often makes people think, hey, I found a lady beetle. But if we look at these, we realize a couple things. Note the longer antenna. So these antennae are way longer than the head and pronoda. Okay. If we look at these sort of the specimen down below here, this type of beetle has these unique little sort of impressed lines on the pronoda. Okay. And these guys are usually found in close association with fungi under bark. Okay, so they're usually not found wandering around on leaf surfaces. They do have that association with the fungus. Hence the common name handsome fungus beetles, if anything, just because they're so beautiful. Another group that people often misidentify as lady beetles are sap beetles. Now, these guys have much stronger clubbed antennae. So we're talking about those sort of clavated clubbed antennae within the lady beetles, but nothing so pronounced and so strong as these guys. This is no longer a nice little bat. This is more a stick with a big ball on the end. Okay, so it's a little bit more distinctive. In many of these groups, they have the tip of the abdomen exposed. And these two species I have as representatives, they actually have the abdomen covered, but we do actually have some that have the exposed abdomen if you look at them from above. And if you look at them underneath, again, looking at them under a scope, we have something called a transverse coccyx. So this is the part of the body that joins the leg to the main core of the main body. And they're basically on little joysticks that allow the legs to flex around. And with nididulid sap beetles, they're actually transverse. So they sort of are much more wider across, unlike the lady beetles, which tend to have just a sort of globular looking coccyx. Another common misidea of lady beetles are the chrysomelids. Now, this is a very diverse group, very commonly encountered. As the name suggests, they're often associated with plants because they are plant feeders. There's a wide variety why they come in sort of every shape and size and color, and many of them are is thought to be mimicking lady beetles. Again, where you'll take notice here is that they have very long antennae, so much longer than the head and pronotum here. So those are long filamentous antennae. They tend not to be clubbed. They just sort of segment upon segment with no sort of unique derivation towards the end. The elytra are often striate. Now you might be, what the heck means striate means? Whoop, sorry. If you look at these, there's little punctures and long rows, okay? And that's what we call stria. A lot of beetles utilize these. Often there's little hairs that come along them, but lady beetles don't tend to have these stria. So if you see a lot of stria on the elytra of a beetle, very unlikely to be a lady beetle. These guys also have, if you go into the tarsal segmentation, again, looking really close, you can easily see on this image 1, 2, 3, 4. But the problem is that these guys have a little fifth one hidden away really in deep here. So again, it's a little bit of a difficult character to utilize. My pseudophages, again, being up north, there's a lot of different fungi up there. So you might encounter these guys bouncing around close to fungi or on fungi. Again, they have those longer antennae. Again, those elytra are generally striate, having stria. And probably the most commonly misidentified specimen, especially when it comes to student collections as a lady beetle, are a few of our darkling beetles. This species, Neomyda bipunctata, this is a very commonly encountered species that is usually, again, associated with fungus. Larval segmentation is, tarsal segmentation is completely different. Again, unlike lady beetles, they're usually found in association with the fungus. If you look close again, you can sort of see those stria running along. Just as that light sort of reflects off of it, it becomes a little bit more apparent. And just because I have access to some of these images, there's lots of things that love to mimic a lady beetles. It's not just other beetles, but you do sometimes have something like this. This is actually a tropical species of cockroach. Again, they're utilizing the coloration to help protect them from probably vertebrate predators that are visual, sort of looking away from it because they don't want to get a big old taste of the lady beetle stink. When we look at lady beetles, there are subgroups within the lady beetles. It's the same with birds. Any group you look at, there's a subdivision here. And as lady beetles are a family, previously we've usually treated them as subfamilies. And in many cases, there's sort of 5 subfamilies. But in recent taxonomy, this is done what we call the phylogenetic shuffle. Sometimes things get tossed in together. Sometimes they get pulled back out. So it's hard to keep up with sometimes things like that. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to sort of treat them as 5 subfamilies, if anything, because a major resource that a lot of people utilize, Bug Guide, utilizes these 5 subfamilies. And sort of looking at these 5 subfamilies, we have our small lady beetles, and I'm basically tossing 3 subfamilies into this. Now, these are a group of 3 different subfamilies of small, or generally small lady beetles. Many of them are indescript. Some of them are a little bit fuzzy, so sometimes almost have a bit of peach fuzz. So if you look at the mealybug destroyer up here, you can sort of see that bit of peach fuzz sort of covering over the body. But many of them are quite small, shiny little beetles. Some of them do also have little markings on them. They are often confused with LDB families. Now you're wondering what the heck a LDB is. We call them the little dark beetles. These little dark beetles means that you have to pull out a microscope, look really close at them, count the tarsal segmentations, look underneath, look at different characters. And so they're actually quite difficult to identify. In many cases, these guys actually utilize internal scleratized structures of the males to identify them, and you can't actually identify them in any other way. They are valid species. They have their own unique ecological aspects, but when it comes to identifying them, you need those structures. We do have a plant feeding group of lady beetles. So generally they're not plant feeders, but there are 2 species in Canada that do feed on plants. In this case, this is a Mexican bean beetle. I've encountered this guy just even in my backyard fairly recently. Generally, they almost look like your classic lady beetles. They're generally large, sort of dome-shaped, but they tend to be more of that fuzzier peach. So when we looked at those smaller ones, I had that little peach fuzz all over them. Same is the case with these guys. They're covered over. Both the larvae and the adults are plant feeding, so they can actually be pests in other parts of the world, specifically like south of the border. They don't really occur in large enough numbers up in our area to be a big problem. These guys feed on things like soybeans, alfalfa, other legume products, hence Mexican bean beetles. Another subfamily, a very small subfamily when it comes to Canada, are the Chilocorinae. Probably the most commonly encountered one is the twice-stabbed lady beetle. This is Chilocora stigmata. But there are a handful of other smaller species in Ontario that also belong to this subfamily. Now, these guys are fairly easy to identify because they sort of have the shelf that comes out over the eyes. But really, for the purpose of this, if you have a extremely flattened, if you look at the underside of extremely flattened black lady beetle with these two little dots that basically look like they've been stabbed, then you have a twice-stabbed lady beetle. There are a number of other species that do have red marks on this, but they're not so flat underneath, and they're generally not as large as this. Again, they usually actually belong to those other tiny lady beetle groups, or the smaller lady beetle groups. And then we get into the Costinellidae. Now, the Costinelli is the nominate subfamily, and these is a group that most of us recognize as lady beetles. They're more commonly encountered. They're much more visual because they tend to be larger, much more aposematically colored to sort of draw your attention. So if you look on the right side here, this is something that Dr. Steve Marshall made up a number of years ago. The majority of the common lady beetles in Ontario belong to the Costinellidae. So there's about 5 species, I think, here that do not belong to the Costinellidae. Most of them are relatively easy to identify based strictly on the shape and coloration, though there are a few species that can be a bit variable, and so some caution is needed because you can confuse between the two. Back in the day when the understanding was that the 9-spotted lady beetle was in decline, somebody purported that no, in fact, they were actually quite common, and presented a distribution map of all these different records that he found, not knowing that at that point a new invasive species was coming into Canada. That's Harmonia axyridis, and basically it was being mistaken as so many other different species because of how variable the coloration was, that he was mistaking it and misreporting the fact that this species was indeed disappearing from our fauna. Now, when you look at the project that you guys are looking at, your focus is on sort of 2 lost lady beetles. And this is a group that a number of different people have sought to document over the years, both seeking to collect them for COSEWIC or CSIRO. COSEWIC is our national agency that's responsible for listing species as endangered or threatened, while CSIRO is the provincial agency. COSEWIC tends to actually sort of hire out investigators to actually be able to go around and do this, while CSIRO has a much more modest budget and usually relies upon the efforts of COSEWIC to assist in their assessments. So these 2 species are in large part the focus of the lost lady beetle projects that we've heard farther into the south in the New York state. First up is Costinella novum notata. This is a 9-spotted lady beetle. Currently, it has a conservation status as S1. CSIRO in 2016 has listed it as endangered. And it's a fairly easy species to recognize. It's got 9 spots. So 9-spotted lady beetle, count 9, not too bad. The white's limited to the front of the pronotum. So again, this is that segment right here. So the white is just to the front of it. And also very important to take note is that it's got smooth elytra. And when we look at a species a little later on, that's the Asian multicolored lady beetle, we'll sort of see the difference and the importance of that. Now, this species used to be extremely abundant in Ontario. It's probably one of the most abundantly encountered species. I think it's something like 16% or 10% even of the species that were encountered when people went out, and basically just completely dropped off the map. Towards the end of its occurrence, or at least documented occurrence in Ontario, we're looking at like 0.6% of the species or specimens that were being encountered belong to this 9-spotted lady beetle. And again, it is an endangered species. Just quickly looking at CSIRO assessments, I'm not too sure how many people here are familiar with the different aspects of assessing a species. I had the pleasure of sitting on CSIRO for a number of years, so I was somewhat involved with the discussions of these species. And there's a lot of different things that come into play. So we look at range, where the species have been occurring, population numbers, sort of looking at small population size, restricted populations. We do quantitative analyses if we have them available. So a whole bunch of different things come together. The majority of insects tend to be because it's a restricted size. But in the case of these lady beetles, we were actually able to utilize criterion A, and this is basically a decline in total number of mature individuals. And that's through the utility of examining collections, historical collections, such as the University of Guelph insect collection, and be able to say, hey, look at all this stuff. This is when these species were present. Look at basically almost decade by decade, and we can sort of see that the map is slowly changing as we go over time. And so this is actually an uncommon one for insects because we often don't have a great clue when it comes to the population sizes of these, but because we had the specimens, we were able to infer from that the decline. Now here are two different maps, so sort of discussing the distribution of these guys. On the right side is a Paiero used in their assessment. On the left side is Kosiwick. This is a examination of lady beetles in Canada, and so looking at the changes of their distributions. So as you see, before 1960, throughout southern Ontario, Coccinella novum was actually fairly abundant. And as you go up decade by decade, also those red dots just start disappearing. Only recently was there a specimen found up in Quebec again, which is again suggestive of that maybe if we're looking in different crooks and crannies and different habitats, we might actually encounter these guys again. Paiero is a little bit more blunt there, but basically utilizing it to show the change of distribution in southern Ontario there. A couple of similar species to take note. So on our left side here is Coccinella novum so our 9-spotted lady beetle. Again, there's 9 spots. And if you look at it, you'll sort of see this blue, sort of 2 blue lines there. I utilize that because often this, hopefully you guys can see my cursor, but the little dot that's closer to the edge of the elytra sometimes is really reduced and hard to see. So sometimes it looks like there's just 7 spots. But when you look at these spots, there is almost an obtuse angle here, okay? Much more broader than 90 degrees if you were to put it right in the middle. On the right side here is our invasive or introduced 7-spotted lady beetle. It's got, again, that center dot, but it's just got 3 dots. And if we put the dots through there, it's a right angle. So if you think you've got a 9-spotted lady beetle and then you see a right angle means you got the wrong beetle. In the middle is our problematic Asian multicolored Asian lady beetle. So I'm used to the Latin terms, so often utilizing common names is a little bit difficult for me to utilize at that moment. But so this is Harmonia axaritis. Now this species is problematic because it's extremely variable in coloration. I'll sort of show the difference of colorations that these guys have. But what's key here for their recognition is, number one, they have that almost black M up on that pronotum. Lots of yellow on the front and also yellow at the back. If you look at the elytra too, towards the back of the insect, you'll see these little ridges. Okay, and well, you might be sort of say, I'm not gonna be able to see that when I'm out in the field. Often you're folding the beetle and you sort of roll it and you have a bit of light, you should actually be able to see those ridges, have the light actually bounces on it. Again, there's the arrows. I forgot that I had the animation there. So the arrows show again the coloration of the pronotum there, and also the presence of those elytral folds. And our other species that you guys are interested in trying to document is Coccinella transversogutata. This is a transverse lady beetle. It's got a conservation ranking of S1, and Paiero in 2017 recognized it as endangered. Now it's been declining since the 1980s, hasn't been seen in Ontario since the 1987. So we're looking at a large gap of time that they've been found. This isn't uncommon when it comes to insects. I should be very clear about that. It's not uncommon because often people aren't looking for specific groups of insects. What's unique about lady beetles is that there's been a lot of effort trying to find these guys over the years because they're such a appeasing insect to sort of look at and often draws people's attention. They're more likely to be collected or observed. So it's odd that since 1987, these insects haven't been found, while most other insects, it's again, having these big gaps isn't too surprising. Now these guys can be recognized as basically having sort of 3 rows of sort of transverse dark markings. That front row is basically a complete band across the base of the elytra. And then we sort of have these 2 other transverse bands, basically 2 paired dots that are transverse. Big thing to note here is that they're just black on orange here, okay? There's no surrounding markings. There's no delimitation of the black. It's just black straight to orange, okay? As an endangered species, same thing. These guys, because we've been able to utilize collections such as the University of Guelph and many other collections too, we're able to sort of say that they have declined over a substantial time period. Many cases, we can claim a species as has been extirpated if it's gone beyond 50 years, if there's been since it's last been recorded. Again, there's some question about how much more sampling effort we need to go there with Ladybeetles. So things like this project that you guys are undertaking are exceptionally key to helping us out determine that. Here again is the same sort of a set of patterns for resources. So again, the Kasiwik report on Ladybeetles and the Casaro assessment. So here again, we have Costanella transversa guttata, extremely abundant throughout most of Ontario. Maybe not quite getting up to Northern Ontario, but that's also a bit of a problem because a lot of us don't go up to Northern Ontario. There's not a lot of great roads to get up there. So short of flying up there and specifically being up there to collect Ladybeetles, we're probably not gonna get a lot of dots up there anyways. But again, as you see over time, it starts to dwindle. And then there's a big jump from 1980 to 1989 to the 1990, 1991. The also in the species is just sort of occurring in a few little spots. But again, this is to say that they're still out there. And again, with a bit of effort, maybe we can find these little pockets as was done in New York. Again, the assessment on the right side, this is a Casaro assessment. We utilize not just the number of occurrences, but also looking at decrease in range. So we use a little program that's called GeoCat that sort of says, what's the data range, or what's a geographic range, and how much is it contracted in a certain time period. Now these are 2 different Costanella species. Again, both very similar in having sort of 3 bands or sort of 3 transverse markings across the elytra. If you will notice on the right side though, this one actually has light markings around the dark markings. So there's almost this little bit of a halo. They have much more extensive markings in that aspect. But again, those little halo really makes it sort of apparent and a distinct species from our transversa guttata. The big no sign is basically just to say that is not transversa guttata on the right. Now, you guys are going to be looking at those 2 species and your effort is to document them. And that's because there's been a lot of onus, and these are species that have been declared as endangered in Ontario. But there's a number of other species that are in decline. Same potential causes, invasive species and imported disease that might come with these species, along with a lot of habitat alteration. As humans, we've done a great job of really sort of messing up natural corridors, uniquely little microhabitats that might have occurred. We've sort of come in and sort of really made a mess of it. So first perspective, when we look at the invasive beetles, it's important to realize their impacts on them. A lot of our native beetles, when they've come in, their disappearance is at the same time as these introduced species are starting to appear. And if you actually look into the Kasiwik report on the Ladybeetles, they'll go into this very in-depth. They'll actually have little bar charts beside each other, basically sort of showing, this species disappears at the same time as this one starts peaking up. That's not always the case. And in many cases, these species have declined before these invasive species have come in, and maybe the invasive species have just sort of made it a lot more difficult for these guys to come back from whatever else was previously impacting them. One of the most common species now in Ontario is the 7-spotted ladybeetle, especially in agricultural settings. Probably go anywhere, sweeping that around during the summer, and you're very likely to encounter one of these guys. I mean, these guys are the right-angled markings here. So you go from that spot, that spot, that spot. It's almost a perfect little right angle. Again, 7 spotted because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 spots. Fairly distinctive species, fairly large species. This one was intentionally introduced to North America as a biocontrol agent a number of different times. It kept failing every time it got introduced. But at some point it finally took off. It's now found from Florida to Alaska. Again, it's the most successful lady beetles in North America. And it's thought to be competitively excluding those 2 previous Coccinella species. Ironically, it was actually named the state insect for Delaware, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Ohio, and Tennessee, not realizing that it was an invasive species. So again, right angle makes it very distinct, especially with those 7 spots. Now, Harmonia axyrudis, this is our multicolored Asian lady beetle. I make sure to spell multicolored the Canadian version, as most cases and many times it's taken on the American spelling. This species, especially following soybeans, the soybean aphid invasion became extremely abundant. If you look at the top of the image, you can also see a couple, and actually the bottom middle, you can also see a couple 7 spotted lady beetles sort of mixed together. Often these guys occur in large numbers, especially as they get washed ashore, especially after heavy rains. Sometimes they overwinter in sort of aggregations. These guys have been known to quote unquote nip for many years. Steve Marshall argued that they never ever nipped, have handled literally hundreds of thousands of these things. But every once in a while you get the rare beetle who decides that maybe your arm's tasting a little bit good, not realizing that you are a large predator. And takes a little bit of nip out of you. So they're not really purposely biting you. They just probably think that a bit of your skin cells happen to taste good as they're standing on top of you. Now, these guys were again intentionally introduced for much of the 1900s. Didn't actually become established until the late 80s in Louisiana. Unfortunately, the late 80s means that these guys probably appeared after a lot of our native species were already declining. Quickly spread throughout North America and reached Canada in 1994. So their appearance was a little bit after a lot of our species that already started to decline, but it probably made it a lot more difficult for those species as they now had another lady beetle to battle with. They basically eat everything. They're plentiful to the point of nuisance. You probably have had them in your homes as they overwinter. They love to have refuge there. For a long time, we're having a big issue in Niagara region because they ruin the wine. They get into the grapes, and as the grapes are pressed, unfortunately, we get that reflex bleeding. And the next thing you know is we have what's called lady beetle taint, and it basically makes the wine extremely unpalatable. I think our ice wines were extremely susceptible to that, and a lot of wine was discarded because of these lady beetles. They're nearly immune to disease, which is a wonderful thing, I guess, if you're one of these lady beetles, because they have the diverse antibiotic chemicals in their hemolymph. Steve Marshall used to refer to them as war criminals because they also harbored large numbers of fungi that can have zero effect on these guys, but can have an extremely profound impact on other lady beetles. So again, with these lady beetles being introduced, they're also bringing in disease. And because they basically eat everything, these guys have no problem about eating the larvae of other lady beetles. So often we say intraguild predation. You might see that if you're ever examining the literature when it comes to lady beetles. That basically just means a lady beetle eating another lady beetle. And these guys, again, so voracious that they will take upon that moment. The key one to identifying, again, Harmonia, is looking for that little ridge on the back of the elytra. So you can seriously see them in a lot of these images that are in focus. Again, you can seriously see how the light hits in just such a way that you can actually see that ridge. So even the ones that have really weird colorations, and here you can see the ridge, here you can see the ridge, that ridge really sets it out as the multicolored Asian lady beetle. They will mention that there is a second species of Harmonia that was also introduced to Eastern North America. For the better, it seems to be largely restricted to the East Coast of the United States. Hasn't really become as much of a problem as Harmonia axyrudis. Again, nowadays, it can be one of the most commonly encountered species. Again, it's problematic for quick identification due to the variation of those colorations. But again, that fold makes it fairly easy to separate from our other species. Now, taking into account, we've already looked at these 2 species that you guys are focusing on. We're looking at these 2 other species that are extremely abundant and common to encounter. There are a number of other beetles that are of conservation interest. I sat down with, I'm not sure how many of you guys are familiar with a NatureServe. NatureServe is this wonderful repository of information that synonymizes the data of conservation rankings for different provinces or countries, and sort of summarizes all the data in this one wonderful, concise web page for each species. Now, when it comes down to it, when we're looking at about those, they only had 80 species listed on this, and unfortunately, I had one of them duplicated. Sorry, 82 species, but they had one of them duplicated, so there's only 81 present. When we looked at it, there's 6 S1 species, and when we think of S1 species, these are species that are highest conservation concern or ranking. So our Costinella novenatata and Costinella transversicutata are both S1 species. We also have a few S2 species, so we have 4 of them there. And then we have a number of S4 species. So these are fairly stable species. There's not too much concern about these guys becoming endangered or threatened with endangerment. We also have a few that there's not enough data to support what they are. So that's our SNR species, which means not ranked. This could be because of issues regarding their identification or maybe issues regarding the provenance of the records. Then we have 5 not assessed species, and these are basically just our introduced species. We don't assess introduced or invasive species. There's no point to it. These are not a native element to Canada, so there's no point in trying to conserve them here. What's interesting is the number of SU species. So these are species that are unranked. It's not that they weren't ranked, it's that the range of the ranking went beyond 2 levels. So if I had an S4 and an S5 species, it sort of fell between that, then they'd actually listed as an S4/S5 species. But if the data that I input suggests that it could be extremely rare or could it be extremely common, which basically would sort of say an S1 to S5 species, it comes out as SU. So that might sound really confusing, but just to sort of condense it, it's basically like we have so little data for these 38 species that they could be threatened or they could be extremely abundant. We just don't know enough about them to indicate that. I'm going to take a quick peek at those 6 species, those 6 N1 species, and those 4 S2 species, just to put it into perspective, ignoring the 2 other species that we discussed earlier, the 9-spotted and the transverse lady beetle, because again, we've already discussed why they are S1s. So one of our S1s is Hyperaspis morans. This is a species whose type material was basically collected off of Lake Superior in Ontario, but otherwise is not well documented. It doesn't seem like there's much data out there at all about the species. I do believe this is one that requires internal genitalia to identify, so it makes it a little bit more difficult to sort of say if it's present or if nobody's just gone through the effort of actually examining the material for it. When we get into a number of other species, these are species that are widespread in the eastern United States, and probably only barely reach southern Ontario. So they're on the northern limit of their range, and there's a handful of records, maybe 1, maybe 2 or 3, depending on the species, that are known to occur in Ontario. So they're not high conservation ranking because they're sort of on the northern fringe. They're edge species, basically, is what it falls down to for us. So there hasn't been a lot of attention paid to these guys because it's not like their numbers are declining. It's just that they're sort of right on the threshold of being present in Ontario. And then we have 2 other species that are northern species. So these are way up north. You're very unlikely to encounter these unless you hop on a plane and fly up to some of the more remote communities up there. And they are so highly ranked in the conservation rankings because we have very few specimens, and they're probably just on the southern limit in northern Ontario. In the Kusibrick report, there were other species that were sort of drawn attention to the fact that they are species of concern. And I will sort of discuss each one of these a little bit more in a second here, so you don't have to read each of these, except to sort of say the Hippodamia parentheses, when we get into it a little bit later on, they don't have any data for Ontario because they weren't a target species when they were databasing, which means they're unable to provide those decade-long time periods to show how they changed over time. So this is a species that you guys should be aware of. Be prepared, try to sort of suss out, try to document them in Southern Ontario. It's a two-spot lady beetle. It is listed as S4 in NatureServe back as far as 2007. Back as far as 2007, we realized that they were declining. So it's a bit of a disparity between documentation that's being provided versus the ranking here. So it might just be a bit of an issue of what data is available. So this is, again, something that you guys should be aware of. They basically are just a fairly orange lady beetle with 2 black spots, fairly distinct in that way. Note that it is a widespread species, naturally occurs in the whole Arctic. And the whole Arctic means it occurs in parts of Asia and Europe and in North America. Okay, so this species, while it might be declining, it is found in other parts of the world. So in these other parts of the world, they're probably not as much of a conservation concern that way. They also occur, they naturally occur in the whole, in the Palearctic, so that's parts of Europe and Asia, with a lot of our invasive species. So we know that they can get along with the invasive species, but perhaps our North American populations haven't developed the resistance to maybe the diseases that some of these guys might be bringing in. As well as species, again, if you look at the sort of the data here, before 1960, lots of different records, and slowly the records seem to sort of come down. We're still sort of having some in Southern Ontario, but again, not a common species by any means. So something definitely to put on the hit list of things in your study. Hippodamia tridecim punctata, basically 13-spotted lady beetle, another S4 species. And we're like, oh, another S4 species, not high ranking. It is considered a whole Arctic species again, which again, this means that species is occurring with a lot of these invasive species in its natural native range in the Palearctic. Again, looking at the data that CSIRC provides, again, we are seeing a decline in this. Okay, the fact that these species again are commingling with Costinella, the invasive Costinellids in the Palearctic, suggests that maybe they aren't being impacted by these guys, but there are other issues involved. Again, either invasive pathogens or again habitat alteration by humans. And the parentheses lady beetle. This is a lady beetle, a Hippodamia parenthesis. This is an S4. Again, this is a species that was not documented in their study, but there was some suggestion that there were declines in several different jurisdictions. Now, this species can be somewhat mistaken for the larger parentheses beetle, or Hippodamia glacialis, but something to take note of. See this big yellow spot that occurs on parentheses. This is something that's absent in glacialis. Glacialis just has these 2 little yellow marks that come back. And we saw this one earlier. This is a 3-banded lady beetle. So Costinella transverse, should be trifasciata. I've got the wrong name at the top there, but the right name on the left. This is S4. And again, note the halo around the electro markings. So this is a species that's apparently thought to be in decline. It is also very similar to our transverse guttata. So something to take note of, even if you do find one and it's not the transverse guttata that you wish it to be, please take note because it could still be a species at risk in the future. Again, there seems to be suggesting that they are declining. In New York, apparently there was a heavy decline since the 1980s. Again, those bold markings, except for the fact that they've got a halo around it to separate them from transverse guttata. Now I say SIR, small lady beetles. Again, this is harder to say because there's less ongoing collections of them. They're smaller, less commonly collected, easily overlooked by sort of a general collector. Also a lot more harder to identify. Again, nobody really wants to sit down and examine the male genitalia of these things or do genetic sampling. It's much more easier for us to be looking at those larger beetles. That being said, there is a good chance that there are some small lady beetles that are species at risk. We already saw 4 of the 6 S1 ranked species are small lady beetles. And the majority of the SU ranked species are also small lady beetles. I think something like 35 of the 38 species of the SU are actually these small lady beetle groups. Again, difficult or sometimes problematic to identify, but again, they might be something of importance. Now, when it comes down to it, so you're saying there's lots of different species out there. How the heck am I going to identify all these things? When it comes to especially your two species and sort of lookalikes, there's two major references, and one of them is kind of a local guide. Now, the second one is a North American treatment, but I'll start with the local guide. I talk about Steve Marshall. Again, he's an individual who's been doing photography of insects for a long period of time. And here he's actually sort of developed basically almost an insect collection in a book and that he utilizes for teaching, but he's written in such a way that it should be more of a natural history approach. He has basically documented all these species, and a lot of these images are of Ontario species. And he actually documents all the species that you'd be concerned of looking at them. He often even sort of indicates how to separate different species utilizing the characters visible in his images. Now, if you want to be a little bit more hardcore and really dive into it, there is the Costinellidae of American North and Mexico. Now, there are some invasive species that have been introduced since then, so it's just a matter of sort of knowing where these guys might fall into. But this tome is absolutely amazing because it looks at all the different aspects. It looks at the distribution, so you can sort of see the distribution on the right side there for Skimnus fraternus. It looks at the different structures on them. It provides keys for you. It's just a bit more problematic because it does include all of North America. Now, you might be just saying, well, this is something very focused, really hard to find. This is freely available at the Biodiversity Heritage Library, easily downloadable. It's a great reference. And if there's any questions about identification, the buck would probably stop there, except for a couple of invasive species. So something to consider if you're looking at it. Now, there are lots of other books floating around. One of them is Beetles of Eastern North America. And I put a big do not enter sign here. Not to say that this book isn't great. This is a great book for somebody beginning to get familiar with the different families of Costinellums. But because he's approaching it as Eastern North America, he often just has a single representative of each genus, unlike Steve Marshall's approach, which includes basically a lot of our species. Basically, I think there's only a single Costinella representative in the beetles of Eastern North America. So highly suggest Insects in Natural History. The book itself can run somewhere between 60 and 100 bucks. Well worth it, in my opinion. If you're looking for absolutely free, then you have Costinellidae of America, North and Mexico. Great resource. But something else to consider if you are a flipper, and it's a little bit dangerous to do so, but all of us do it, is Bug Guide. And sometimes I'm actually surprised when people aren't familiar with Bug Guide, probably because it's a resource I utilize on a fairly regular basis. This is basically a whole series of different images contributed by everybody across North America of different insects, and they've been curated by both experts and entomologists, enthusiastic naturalists to help identify them. So I often go on this if I think I know the group, but I don't know the species. I'll sit down with it and I'll often go to what's called the browse function, which will usually give me about 4 or 5 different images of each group. So I can compare it to what I have. And basically I'll just keep on clicking. And as I get deeper and deeper, hopefully I sort of go along the right way. Basically, it's almost a bit of a choose your own adventure when it comes to insect identification. And often the problem with these guys is often the species that are represented at the top aren't indicative of all the species within the group. Okay, so sometimes those first 5 or 6 pictures can lead you erroneously in the wrong direction and make a misidentification. But again, it's a great resource. Again, you can upload your own images there and ask for help with identification if you're comfortable in doing so. So it comes down to it. So now you've got all these different insects. You've gone out there, you started imaging them. If you do encounter any of these species at risk, or even species that might be at risk, or even just the invasive species, it's essential that you actually have some method of vouchering. I get into this because we're discussing how these species have been quantified as being at risk. That's because we've had things like physical specimens to come back to. Now with the digital age, we can also do digital specimens or digital representation. I'll sort of discuss each one of those in a sec, but this basically ensures that proper data has been noted. So where was it found, when was it found, type of habitat, and who, because often who found it is extremely important, so they can lead researchers or specialists or conservation agencies back to the site to find the exact little microhabitat where you found them. In regards to the vouchering, physical vouchers, I am an insect collector. That means I often take specimens. It's extremely important to do so. Often enables close examination of the material, so we can look at microscopic characters. Allows us to do genetic studies if needed. If deposited at a credible institution, ensures long-term protection and access to researchers across the board. It can also supplement digital vouchering. I'll mention digital vouchering in a second. But I will put the caveat that permits are often needed for some sites. Things like provincial parks, any conservation lands often require permits or at least permissions to collect insects before you do so. In many cases, there are institutions that are happy to take these. And so it's just a matter of reaching out to somebody. I love to say the University of Guelph, but the ROM has great facilities. Canadian National Collection has facilities. You might even consider having your own little collection that you maintain, but do consider also depositing material at one of these other institutions to ensure access to the scientific community. Now, in terms of going digital, I'm going to say no impact on population. I have to sort of go back here. Minimal to negligible impact on population when it comes to physical vouchers. There's very little to no real evidence to suggest any insect collectors have really sort of contributed to a species going extinct, unless it was a species that was already sort of going out the door and somebody purposely did that. So unless you're actively trying to sort of hunt down every single insect, you're going to have a very negligible impact on the populations. When we look at sort of those dots that were in those distribution maps, those aren't populations, those are records, okay? So each one of those dots probably represents hundreds of different beetles, if not more. So you're basically taking a single individual from hundreds of individuals. So again, very low impact. I know some people are very reticent about collecting insects. If you go digital, there's no impact on population, unless you're a little harder on them when you're taking images. Basically, you're sharing images on citizen science portals, things like iNaturalist. I imagine most of you guys are familiar with it, but if not, check it out. It's a great resource. If anything, it enables you to share data with other enthusiasts. It shares distribution data with places like the NHIC. This is a Natural Heritage Information Center based out of Peterborough. So if you have a species at risk, be it an insect, a vertebrate, a plant, then your record actually goes into their data stream, enables them to actually be able to track these species. It also gives preliminary identification services. So when you upload an image, it'll give you suggestions on what you might think that insect is. Not always perfect, often way off base, but at least it gives you a starting point, and then other people can come in and curate it. And I'm just going to toss in a remember here. A lot of people take a single shot of an insect and that's it, done. When it comes to these, again, a lot of insects require a lot of microscopic examination. At the very least, try to take multiple shots at different angles, try to get as close to it as possible to really show off these different characters for people to assist in the identification. Considering having reference measures. So I know people in the aquatic industry, if they're collecting fish, will often have plastic with some water in it, and then basically a ruler behind it, enable us to sort of say how big these are. Again, because some of these beetles do look similar, if they're little tiny beetles or large beetles are similarly marked, having reference sizes is valuable. So again, something to really take into consideration there. Just looking at INAT, Again, I presume most of you guys are familiar with it. I'll sort of show you a record that sort of tossed on there not long ago, but consider creating a project. Consider creating a Costanellidae of the highlands here. This basically will enable you to keep tallies of what species are being found, both in terms of numbers, but also just sort of alpha in terms of like just a species list. You can also see who's out there doing a lot of observations. So you might be able to sort of tap them and just say, hey, I think I found this. You have a bit of experience identifying it. Can you help me out here? Even having a project like that also helps contribute to other projects. So I mentioned the Natural Heritage Information Center often draws data from it. And it also can contribute to something like this. This is the Costanellidae of Ontario. So all the data will actually help go into that data, into this other project too. If you're not familiar with iNaturalist, basically here is a quick little shot. This is a red-headed woodpecker. This is something I observed down in Windsor not long ago. Not quite a species at risk. I think it's a near threatened, but it hadn't been observed for a little bit in the area. So I decided to make sure I posted this observation. As you can see at the bottom, it's now actually tagged with 2 different projects, Rare Species in Ontario by the NHIC, but also the locals in the area do keep a project of the biodiversity of the Ojibwe Prairie Complex. If you look on the right side too, if for some reason you're worried about this data being shared in such a way that somebody does come and collect them all, or you don't want people tromping through your neighborhood looking for these things, you can choose an obscured or private geoprivacy that basically does not allow people to sort of see where the species exactly was done. It'll basically create a dummy marker in the general area and it'll take note of that. Places like the NHIC do have permissions still to access the original data, especially if it's obscured. I think private data might even be limited from them, but it still enables you some measure of protection so you don't feel like maybe your privacy is being invaded by presenting these observations. And I imagine I'm getting pretty close to time here, a little over 8 o'clock, my apologies. Just in summary, 2 ladybeetles are relatively easily identified species, and based on other efforts throughout North America, they could occur still in habitat pockets, maybe just even in your guys' backyards kind of thing. In efforts to document these 2 species, you should also take the chance to really ensure other species are being adequately identified, documented, especially as they are relatively easily identifiable. And again, try to utilize these efforts to summarize through citizen scientist portals and to enhance your own studies of these guys. And I now open up the floor to questions. Again, if I've been mumbling anything, by all means, send me an email. If you want to figure out how to get a link to the Biodiversity Heritage Library, anything like that, just let me know. And I pass the mic over to Shelley.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Steve. Can everybody hear me? Let's see, hang on. Just a second. Okay. Can everyone hear me or no? Yes, okay, you can. Okay, good. So thanks so much, Steve. That was a really in-depth, but also really accessible talk, and I really appreciate that. I have to show, when you were talking about Steve's book, I had to go and grab my copy from the shelves. This is the first edition, so it's got a different image on the front, but I can vouch for the fact that it's an excellent book. So what we can do now is maybe if Steve, if you have a little bit of time still, it'd be great if there are any questions out there, you can either put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask. So I'll stop talking for a second. So if anyone wants to speak up, you can ask a question.
Shelley, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about if we do conduct a small little bug blitz on some of our properties, are there particular places where we should be looking, or are you basically, is any habitat fair game?
There are some suggestions that these guys have preferences for habitats, but ladybeetles tend to be sort of more generalist predators. They'll take advantage of anything that sort of comes their way. So if there's a nice little aphid accumulation, they probably will sort of light upon it and start predating upon them. So in terms of direction, not a lot of great direction for you there. Lady beetles are attracted to light traps. You do find them up in the canopy, and you will find them sort of flying around. I usually suggest trying to find a edge habitat. So often what happens at edge habitats is you have both sort of habitats are contributing to the sort of overall fauna of them. And so you might sort of get the fauna of both sides. So I probably suggest that something like that, you know, the edge of a field with a forest, natural field, try not to go for agricultural field, or a shoreline with sort of sedge meadows, things like that. Trying to sort of mix it up a little bit. But again, the species that have been have seemed to have disappeared are more sort of native species, probably associated with sort of more forested environments. So I'd probably just keep on trying to wander around forested environments, try to find, you know, unique little crooks and crevices that maybe small populations could have established and maintained.
Yeah, that's great. And just to, I don't know if you two know each other, maybe Steve and Ed, but we're lucky up here to have some excellent naturalists and biologists in the area. And Ed is our partner who's going to be heading up the search for the beetles. And so I think, I wasn't sure if you guys knew each other, but there's your introduction. So, so we're really excited about that. Hi, Ed. I didn't mean to call you on the spot there.
Ed, if you don't have it already, check out the Lady Beetles of North America. They do discuss different habitats. So if you are for each species, so do consider things like that. A lot of cases, again, because they're generalist predators, they tend to be a little harder to completely pin down to a specific habitat. They don't really, you know, when we think of our invasive species, they've kind of taken over our agricultural fields, you know, dirty, nasty agricultural fields that lots of chemicals and things have been poured into. So try to keep away from those, and, you know, even a distance from them, because the impacts of those invasives probably will even be felt even distances within the natural habitats.
Okay, great. Thanks, Steve.
I see a question from Ian in the chat.
Yeah.
You know, what roles do they play in our ecosystem? Obviously, the predators, so they're helping. If you want to sort of call it a role, you know, it's what they do. You know, their job is to feed on things so they can perpetuate their next little generations. But they do help maintain control of phytophagous insects, specifically aphids, scales, other soft-bodied insects. They do prey upon bugs that attack agricultural crops. So again, when you think of soybean aphids, Harmonia was on that. You know, when soybean aphids landed, Harmonia was more than happy to just consume and multiply. So they're a decent control. Again, a lot of people would import them back in the day, thinking we'd release these beetles into our garden and they'd all stay around my prized roses and they'd feed on all the aphids on them. Not knowing the biology of them, because often these insects were collected when they were clustering. And what happens is that when they're clustering, they tend to be overwintering or over the stressful periods. And once that stressful period ends, they disseminate. They go every which way. They're just like, let's get out there and sort of find new places. So here, these insects are being brought to a brand new environment that's probably great habitat with hosts, but they're just like, hey, we're no longer being stressed out. Let's go spread out, and they leave the garden to the garden's devices, and the aphids are still having a wonderful time on your prize roses. So they're not a great sort of directed control. If you have a high population around, and yes, they definitely do play a role in controlling the aphids, but you don't just bring them into your backyard and just say, feed on the aphids and let my flowers behave.
Yeah. Do they provide much of a food source? I know they're toxic, or at least not tasty to things, but are there things that eat them, or are the larvae less toxic, or
There are numbers of insects that do feed on them. There's lots of wasps that utilize them. There's one of our beetles gets zombified. If you look up zombie lady beetle wasp, You'll probably get up into the National Geographic webpage where you sort of see this wonderful lit lady beetle with this large cocoon underneath. And what's happened there is this wasp was actually developed inside of them, basically feeding on, as awful as it sounds, the internal gonads and whatnot of the beetles themselves to develop, leaving actually all the musculature and everything else farther forward to be active. So this lady beetle can still run around, still feed. It's not acting as like just a lying over a corpse that something else might come along and feed upon, basically protecting the wasp, developing wasp. When the wasp emerges, it has to emerge outside of the lady beetle, but somehow it's able to modify the lady beetle to hang on top of the cocoon. And if anything comes along, i.e. another parasitoid, the lady beetle will actually try to kick this other thing away. And it's basically being zombified to protect this cocoon. Now, there are cases where the lady beetles do recover and they wander off. Unfortunately, they'll live non-reproductive life because unfortunately all their internal genitalia has been consumed and they're unable to reproduce, but they can at least sort of, I guess, wander around and see a couple more sunsets. Yeah, there are lots of things that feed on lady beetles, but a lot of vertebrates are dismayed by them because of that hemolymph. And I imagine a lot of other insects are also done so that they might actually have to feed around these chemicals where possible.
Wow, that sounds like a horror movie plot. I think why has no one made a movie about the zombified ladybugs?
I'm sure there is somehow, but
yeah. Any other questions, folks? So Steve, I just have a quick question while waiting to see if anyone else has any, just about the vouchering. Yep. So when it comes to, species like this that are really, they haven't been seen really much at all or in this, in these parts or the province, is that a situation where you would hold off on kind of collecting any that we find, or is the kind of...
Well, again, the beauty of the digital world now is that you can post it up there, and if you have great shots, especially great series of shots that adequately show the different characters, you don't really need the specimen for it. You will get some people that are very nervous about, like, well, these are maybe not entomologists or enthusiastic naturalists, so maybe their identifications are wrong, but you've got the images there. You have the data there. If there's a really big question, then they could go in and take vouchers. The problem with some of the digitization is the worry that this data may be lost. You could sort of say the same with the physical collection. We saw a couple of years ago, the Rio de Janeiro collection burnt down, which probably hosted so much data on tropical insects of Brazil. That's a rarity, but sometimes it happens. Sometimes collections do lost. Digital collections, you can still withdraw specimens. You can still withdraw the data. So if somebody's just having a bad day, or there's become some animosity within a group and they decide to delete all the records, then those records might not be as accessible anymore to the scientific research. So again, it's something that to consider, especially when it comes to these little tiny guys that probably the identification of them is going to require closer examination. You might consider having some vouchering happening. The larger lady beetles, again, probably don't need it so much.
Yeah. Okay, great. Any other questions from anyone? We have a thank you from Ralph and Colleen. So thanks so much, Steve, for taking the time to put this together for us and to give us this really fascinating insight into this group of insects. Thanks again to the Ontario Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, their Species at Risk Stewardship Program that's helping to fund this whole initiative. And thanks to all of you for joining in. And just supporting the sort of outreach initiatives that the Land Trust does. So I hope everyone is now kind of inspired to get out and look for these things in your own backyards. You can take photos and get in touch with the Land Trust if you see anything and send photos in. And thank you, Steve, also for allowing us to record this. So for anyone who wants to watch this again for some of those details, and anyone who wasn't able to join us live tonight, that's going to be made available on our website. So keep your eyes peeled. Those of you who are in the county or coming to the county in the summertime for more information from us about our search for the lost lady beetles. And yeah, take care, everyone. Thanks so much.
Just as a last wrap up, just remember when it comes to, when you think of those distribution maps that we saw earlier on, those are probably created by collections by a couple dozen people. When it comes to something, and that's basically over all of Ontario. When you look at something like an effort like this, you guys have an ability to really document what's present in a very sort of smaller area and have a lot of people on the ground that are able to do that. You know, as opposed to maybe a single entomologist wandering around looking at 20 different groups. If you guys are focused on those lady beetles, I'm sure you're going to find some fun stuff there. More eyes, more feet on the ground means lots more cool stuff to find.
Great. Well, we'll keep you posted on what we find.
Cheers.
Okay, thanks folks, and enjoy the rest of your evening.